Concussive traumatic brain injury, Rogelio Perez. Identification of concussion. So concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries have several causes. The most common would be direct or blunt force to the head, or a violent momentum shift or whiplash. In either case, you're negating the cerebral spinal fluid, which is a kind of cushioning that protects the soft matter of the brain. So with sufficient trauma or force, you can make the brain actually contact the internal of the skull, which causes bruising and hemorrhaging. And then if you get a violent momentum shift or whiplash, your blood vessels and neurons can experience a lot of torsive strain. In any case, a concussion manifests in a lot of different symptoms. You can get headache or vomiting, lethargy, mood changes, and up to loss of consciousness. Now, there isn't a clear distinction between what would constitute a mild TBI or a concussion and then a major traumatic brain injury. Some more obvious ones would be penetration of the skull, or if the loss of consciousness is greater than 30 minutes. But that said, epidemiological studies rarely make a distinction, especially when it comes to statistical analyses, and so we will be continuing with the distinction of just TBI. Prevalence and impact. So in the year 2014, there were 2.9 million TBI diagnoses in the US, and this number is slightly inflated just because it includes hospitalizations, ER visits, and deaths. That said, the CDC still estimates 75% of these would constitute a concussion. And in the year 2017, TBI hospitalizations were at 224,000 in the US. Now, this is particularly important because a mild TBI or concussion, it may not manifest in very noticeable symptoms, or if it does, they could be just thrown off as like a bad day or a bad headache. But in this state, the brain is very vulnerable as it tries to repair itself, and there are a lot of studies that show that repeated concussive events or trauma to the head can be linked to like long-term structural and chemical changes in the brain. And in this case, you would then require a tertiary strategy as the individual is chronically debilitated or chronically impaired or has emotional instability. The most notable example would be CTE. Age-related incidents. Now there's a very there's a heavy age bias when you look at TBI hospitalization rate, and you can clearly see an outlier in the graph with the 75 and above group, where the 75 and above group has a TBI rate related hospitalization of 320.8 per 100,000, and the next closest group is the 65 to 74 group, which has a TBI hospitalization rate of 102.7 per 100,000. And you can see that the rate drops precipitously as the youth group drops. Now, unfortunately, this actually does have a mechanistic or a cause explanation, just because 49.1, so nearly half of all TBI hospitalizations are due to unintentional falls. And this can be explained with increased age, just because as you get older, you see decreased flexibility, decreased mobility, and yeah, you're more prone to fall unintentionally. But this introduces an area for primary intervention. Any programs that subsidize assisted walking devices or a home railing could help dramatically reduce this rate for this age group. Now, incidence by mechanism and also by gender or sex. So the two most notable causes, and then we'll see the sex bias right now. So the two major causes we want to look at. So for TBI related hospitalization, those that are due to motor vehicle crash have a heavy age bias. We're seeing that the rate for males is 23.3 versus 11.4 in females per 100,000. And then for assault, the bias is even greater. We see that male-related TBI hospitalization is 8.1 versus the female 1.7 per 100,000. Now this again has maybe some more obvious causes, just because men are more likely or more prone to engage in reckless driving or reckless altercations. In any case, you would need a primary intervention just to prevent like an altercation that shouldn't happen, or maybe reckless driving that shouldn't be done. And again, it's particularly important because motor vehicle accidents account for a quarter of all TBI hospitalizations. So informing and maybe requiring seatbelts would be the only primary prevention. Now, incidents by sport. So we can see any recreational activity or sport has a chance for concussion. You're at risk. That said, those with the most risk are contact sports, as we can see the graph to the right for the share of TBI related hospitalizations for youth sports. And again, this has a pretty obvious mechanistic explanation. With contact sports, you're more likely to like throw yourself at someone else, and then if you hit your head, you can experience a mild traumatic brain injury. Now, Clay et al. Actually found something interesting when you look at the incidence for other popular sports. So the incidence rate for high school football was calculated at 1.03 per 1,000 athletic exposures, and the incidence rate for rugby players was calculated at almost 8 per 1,000 athletic exposures. So this is an 8-fold increase in rate, and they're both contact sports. High school football came from rugby, and the only clear distinction that I see would be the difference in helmets, which again, so this introduces an area for primary intervention. Improved helmet design and even mandating helmets for certain sports could reduce the concussion risk, just because a padded helmet helps diffuse the direct force, and yeah, again, reduces the risk of a concussive event. Now, a gender bias in comparable sports, we can see that to the chart to the right. We see that for boys soccer and girls soccer, girls experience a higher rate of concussions, and then similarly in boys basketball and girls basketball. Now, Danishvar et al. Suggested this could be due to a difference in reporting, just because female athletes may be more. They may recognize the symptoms better and be more likely to report them. And Danishvar also suggested an anatomical reason. Girls have, on average, longer necks, which would predispose them to like a violent momentum shift in their head, or whiplash. Public health interventions. So from 2001 to 2009, there was a 62% increase in concussion-related emergency department visits for youths under 19. So this was at nearly 250,000 in 2009. And so the increase in prevalence doesn't necessarily mean that sports are getting more dangerous. I'd suggest it's just from increased monitoring and awareness. Several states, and by 2021, every single state has a youth concussion law that requires training for coaches and youth sport officials to recognize the symptoms. And the Heads Up program from the CDC actually provides guidelines for school nurses, sports coaches, and healthcare providers so that they can recognize the signs and symptoms. And also provides a proper recourse for when's the appropriate time to return to school or sport. In any case, these give the most important intervention strategy when it comes to concussions, because most recreational activities put you at risk for a mild TBI, and so once you do get it, the risk comes from repeated trauma or repeated concussive events, and so making sure that does not happen again is the biggest thing you can do, because again, repeated trauma to the head, that's where you have a greater risk of chronic debilitation or chronic impairment, which again would require a tertiary intervention. My references.